Hello everybody and welcome back to my stream. Hope everybody had some great holidays. I certainly did. Today I'm going to be reading The Charwoman's Shadow by Lord Dunsany. It's a book that has a special place in my heart because it's the first book that I started practicing reading on when I first decided to start getting into audiobook narration. Something that I've always thought was really fun and I wanted to try. Just remember that if you're watching this on YouTube, to go ahead and hit the like button, and I would appreciate that very much. Thank you. The Charwoman's Shadow by Lord Dunsany. Chapter 1. The Lord of the Tower finds a career for his son. Picture a summer evening, somber and sweet over Spain, the glittering sheen of leaves fading to soberer colors, the sky in the west all soft and mysterious as low music, and in the east like a frown. Picture the golden age past its wonderful zenith, and westering now towards its setting. In such a time of day, and time of year, and in such a time of history, a young man was traveling on foot on a Spanish road, from a village well nigh unknown, towards the gloom and grandeur of mountains. And as he traveled, a wind rising up with the fall of day flapped his cloak hugely about him. The strength of the wind grew until little strange cries were in it. The slope steepened, the daylight waned, and the man and his cloak in the evening so merged into one darkness that even in imagination, I can but dimly see him now. Let us, therefore, turn to such questions as who he was, and how he came to be faring at such an hour towards a region so rocky and lonely as that which loomed before him, while the latest stragglers amongst other men were nearing their houses amongst the sheltered fields. His name was Ramon Alonzo Matthew Mark Luke John of the Tower and Rocky Forest. And his father had lately called to him as he played at ball with his sister, beating it back and forth to each other over a deep yew hedge. And the ball had a row of feathers fixed all round it to make it fly gently and fairly, and the yew hedge ended at a white balustrade, and beyond that lay the wild rocks and the frown of the forest. His father called to him as he entered the house, out of the mellow evening, praying his sister to wait. But he talked with his father till all the light was gone, and they played at ball no more. And in such a manner as this spoke the Lord of the Tower and Rocky Forest to his son when they were seated before the logs in the room where the boar spears hung. Whether to hunt the boar or the stag be sweeter, I know not. Methinks the boar, but only the blessed saints know which is truly the sweeter. And yet, there are other considerations besides these, and the world were happier, were it not so. Yet it is ever thus. And the boy nodded his head, for he knew what it was of which his father would speak, that it was of lucre, which hath much to do with worldly affairs. The good fathers had warned him of it, and indeed of this very thing his father told. For however vile or dross-like, he said, gold be in itself, and I do not ask you to doubt that ill repute you have learned of it in the school on the high hill, yet is it necessary in curious ways to many things that are good, as certain foulnesses nourish the roots of the vine. For Emmanuel and Mark are of such a kind that they will have their regular payment, year in, year out, for such work as they do with the horses. Nor is Peter any better in the garden, and it is indeed the same in the dairy. And then there was the teaching that you received from the good fathers on their high hill. Much of this dross went also there, though the work itself was a blessed one. And now it is necessary to put yet more of this gold in a box, and to have it ready against some day when a dowry will be needed for your sister, for she is already past 15, and the rocky structure of our soil being unsuited to husbandry, gold is not easily wrung from it, and there's little of a worldly nature to be won from the forest, and to me it seems that as sin increases on earth, the need for gold grows greater. For myself, if the getting of gold be an art, as some have said, I am past the time for learning a new art. And if it be a sin, my sins are over. Yet you, my son, may haply gather this great necessity for us, or this evil, whatever it be. And if it be a sin, what is one more sin to youth? Not much, I fear. The youth crossed himself. And follow not the way of the sword, continued his father, in no whit diverted from his discourse. For the lawyers ever defeat it with their pens, as hath been said of old. But follow the art, and you shall deal in a matter at whose mention lawyers pell. The black art! exclaimed Ramon Alonzo. There is but one art, said his father, and it shall be all the more advantage you follow it, in that there hath been of late but little magic in Spain. And even in this forest there are not, but on rarest evenings, such mysteries, nor such menace as I myself can remember. And no dragon hath been seen since my grandfather's days. The black art, said Ramon Alonzo. But how shall I tell of this to Father Joseph? And his father rubbed his chin a while before he spoke again. 'Twere hard indeed, he said, to tell so good a man. Yet are we in sore need of gold, and God forbid in his mercy that one of us should ever follow a trade. Amen, said his son. And the fervor with which the boy had said amen hasted his father to hope he would do his bidding, and cheered him on the way with his discourse, which he continued as follows. There is dwelling in the mountains, a day's walk beyond Argonia, whose spires we see, a magician known to my father. For once my father, hunting a stag in his youth, went far into the mountains, as goodly a stag as ever rejoiced a hunter, though once I killed one as good, but never better. I killed mine in the year of the great snowfall, the year before you were born. It had come down from the mountains. But my father hunted his up from the valley, where it had been feeding all night at the edges of gardens. It went home to the mountains, and in dense wood on the slope my father killed it at evening. And then the most curious man he had ever known came down the rocks, walking gently, wearing a black silk cloak, to where he was skinning the stag with his tired hounds sitting round him, and asked my father if he studied magic. And my father said that hunting the stag and the boar were the only studies he knew. And well indeed he studied them, and he taught me. But not all he knew, for no man could learn so much. And then he told the magician something of how to hunt boars. And the magician was pleased, for men shunned him much, and seldom spoke from their hearts of the things they loved, before his portentous cloak and his strange wise eye. And my father warmed to the tales as he told of the thing he had studied, and the stars came twinkling out above the magician, and the gloom was enormous in the ominous wood, and still my father told of the ways of boars, for there was never fear in my father. And the magician asked my father if there was any favor he would have of him, and my father said yes, for he had ever wondered at the art of writing, and he asked the magician if he could write for him. And this the magician did, withdrawing a cork from a horn that hung from his girdle, and that was filled with ink, and taking a goose quill and writing there in the wood upon a little scroll that he took from a satchel. And they parted in the wood, and my father remembered that day, all his years, as much for what he had seen the magician do, as for the splendid horns he had won that day. And when the writing came to be read, it was seen that it was a letter of friendship, or welcome, to my father, or to whomever he should send with that scroll to the house in the wood. Now, my father cared only to hunt the boar and the stag, and had no need of magic, and I have had nothing to do with parchments nor writings. But I can find the scroll at this moment among the tusks of boars that my father laid by. And you shall have the scroll, and go to the wood, and say to that magician, I am the grandson of him that taught you of the taking of boars, nigh 80 years agone. But will he yet live? Asked Ramon. He were no magician else, replied his father. And the boy sat silent then, regretting the thoughtlessness that his hasty words had revealed. With the mystery of writing, which you will doubtless study there, I have myself some acquaintance, having sufficiently studied the matter, some while since, to be able to practice it, should the occasion ever arise. But of all the mysteries that he hath the skill to teach you, the one to study most diligently is that one which concerns the making of gold. Yes, yes, he said, silencing with a wave or two of his hand some hasty youthful objection that he saw on the boy's lips. I wot well the sin that is inherent in gold. Yet, methinks there is some primal curse upon it, put there by Satan before it was laid in earth, which may not cling to the gold that philosophers make. And youth and haste again urged another question. But can the philosophers make gold? Blurted out Ramon Alonzo. Ill-informed lad, said his father. Have you heard of no philosophers during the last 10 centuries seeking for gold with their stone? Yes, answered Ramon Alonzo, but I heard of none that found it. And his father shook his head with tolerant smiles, and answered nothing at once, not hastening to reprove the lad's ill-founded opinion, for the wisdom of age expects these light conclusions from youth. And then he instructed his son in simple words, telling him that the value of gold lies not in any especial power in the metal, but purely in its rarity, and explaining so that a child could have understood that had these most learned of men who gave their lives to alchemy acquainted the vulgar with the fruits of their study, as soon as their art had taught them the way of transmuting base metal, they would have undone in one garrulous moment the advantage that they had earned by nights of toil, working in lonely towers while all the world had rest. And more simple arguments, he added, sufficient to correct the hasty error of youth, but too obvious and trite to offer to the attention of my reader. Having then explained that the philosopher's stone must have been often found and put to the use for which it was intended, he recommended the study of it once more to his son. And the young man weighed the advantages of gold with all that he had learned in its disfavor, and there and then decided to follow that study. Gladly, then, the Lord of the Tower and Rocky Forest went to his rummage room, where strange things lay, and none interfered with the spider. And in that dim place where one scarce could have hoped to find anything, amongst heaps of old fishing nets that had become solid with dust, where worn-out boar spears lay on the floor, and rusted bandoleros that had once pricked famous bowls, blunt knives and broken tent pegs, and things too old for one to be able to name them at all, unless one washed them and brought them out in the light. Groping amongst all these, the Lord of the Tower found a pale heap of boar's tusks, and the scroll amongst them, as he had told his son. Then he left the place to the spider, and returning with the scroll to his son, he brought also a coffer out of another room, a small stout box of oak and massive silver, well guarded by a great lock, all lined within with satin. And he took a great key, and carefully unlocked it, and showed it to Ramon Alonzo as he gave him the scroll of the magician. He held the coffer open, with the light blue satin showing, and said never a word. The young man knew it for the coffer of his sister's dowry, and saw that it was empty. And by the time his father had closed the box again, and carefully locked it and placed the key in safety, the boy's young thoughts had roamed away to beyond Aragona, to the man with the black silk cloak, and his house in the wood, where base metals would have to suffer wonderful changes, before good, thick pieces of dross should chink deep on that satin lining. And where young thoughts have roamed, there soon follow lads or maidens. And then they talked of the way beyond Aragona, and the path that led to the wood, and the father leaned in his chair in comfort at ease, for it wearied him to speak of things that are hard to understand, and especially the getting of money. And he had thought of this matter for days before he had spoken of it, and it had never seemed sure to him that the money would come at all. But now, all seemed clear, and he rested. And leaning back in his chair, he told the way to his son, which was easy as far as the wood. And after that, he could ask the way of such men as he met, and if he met none, he was likely near the house, for men avoided it much. A while they talked of things of little moment, small matters pleasant to both, till the father remembered that more than this was seemly, and reminded his son of all such things as he himself knew, that concerned the decorum and gravity of the study of magic. Indeed, he knew little of this ancient study, but had once seen a conjurer produce a rabbit alive from under an empty sombrero, years ago, outside a village in which he had sought to purchase a cow. And it was this that he meant when he spoke of the slight acquaintance he had himself had with magic. For the rest he spoke of the hoar traditions of magic, which were as antique then as now. For then, as now, they went back past the first gates of history, and ran far on the wide plains of legend, and into the dimness of time. To such traditions, he said, a grave decorum were fitting. And the young man nodded his head, his face full of a fitting decorum. And his father remembered his own youth, and wondered. They parted then, the lord of the tower and rocky forest going to find his lady, the young man still in his chair before the fire, pondering his journey and his future calling. These thoughts were too swift to follow. Pursuing instead the slow steps of his father, we find him come to a room in which, already, discernible shadows were cast by a want of gold, with its ancient sentinel chairs that seemed posted there to check lounging, and its treasure of tapestries, hung to hide ruined panels, or wherever the draughts blew most from untended rat holes. The threat in the room would scarce convey to our minds, could we see it across the centuries, any hint of impending need. And yet, those shadows were there, moving softly, as in slow dances with the solemn folds of the tapestry, or rising to welcome draughts in their secret manner, or lurking by the huge carved feet of the chairs, and always knowing with shadow knowledge, and whispering with shadow talk, and hinting, and prophesying, and fearing, that a need was nearing the tower to trouble its ears. And here the lord of the tower found his lady, whose hair was whitening above a face unperturbed by the passing of time, or anything that time brings. If great passions had shaken her mind, or wandering imaginations often troubled it, they'd pass across that plump and placid face with no more traces than the storms and the ships leave on the yellow sand of a sunny cove. And he said to her, I have spoken with Ramon Alonso, and have arranged everything with him. He is to leave us soon to work with a learned man that lives beyond Aragona, and will win for us the gold that we require, and afterwards some more for himself. More than this he did not say upon that matter, for it was not his way, nor was it then the custom in Spain to speak of business to ladies. And the lady rejoiced at this, for she had long tried to make her husband see that need that was sending its shadows to creep through the tower, telling every nook of its coming. But the boars had to be hunted, and the hounds had to be fed, and 100 things demanded his attention, so that she feared he might never have leisure to give his mind to this matter. But now it was all settled. Will Ramon Alonso start soon? She said. Not for some days, said he. There is no haste. But Ramon Alonso's swifter thoughts had outpaced all this. He was speaking now with his sister, telling her that he was to start next morning for that old house in the mountains of which they had often heard tells, and bidding her tend his great boarhound. They were in the garden, though the gloaming was fading away, the garden that met the lawn on which they had lately played, a little lower down the slope where the towers stood, and shut from the untamed earth and the rocks that were before man by the same balustrade of marble that guarded the lawn. The hawk moths appeared out of the darkening air, from their deep homes in the forest, and hovered by heavy blooms. It was in the midst of the days that are poised between spring and summer. Here, Ramon and Mirandola said farewell in the little pass along which they often had played in years that appeared remote to them, under Spanish shrubs that were like tall fountains of flowers. And whatever the lady of the tower guessed, neither her lord nor Ramon Alonso had any knowledge that there was a glittering flash in the eyes of the slender girl that might laugh away such demands for any dowry, and be deadlier and sweeter than gold, and might mock the men that sought it, and bring their plans to derision, and overturn their illusion, and fill their dreams with its ashes. Ramon Alonso was troubled by no such fancy as this, as he spoke earnestly of his boarhound, and as they spoke of his needs, of combing and feeding, and dryness, they walked back to the tower, and the gloaming was not yet gone, but it was midnight in Mirandola's hair. And so it was that on the following day, at evening, beyond Aragona, a young man was to be seen by such eyes as could peer so far, in his cloak, on a rocky road with his back to the sheltered fields, bound for the mountain upon which frowned the woods, and night and a moaning wind were rising all round about him. Chapter 2. Ramon Alonso comes to the house in the wood. Ramon Alonso had traveled all day, and was 25 miles from his home, and now, alone amongst darkness and storm and rocks, he saw yet no sign of the house he sought, or any shelter at all. He'd come past the sentinel oaks to the gloom of the wood, and neither saw light of window anywhere, nor heard any of those sounds such as rise from the houses of men. He was in that mood that most attracts despair to come to men and tempt them, and indeed it would soon have come, luring him to forsake illusions and give up ambition and hope, but that just in that perilous moment he met a ragged man coming down through the wood. He came with strides, cloak and rags all flapping together, and would have passed the young traveler and hastened on towards the fields and the haunts of men, but Ramon Alonso held him, demanding of him, "Where is the house in the wood?" "Oh, not there, young master, not there," said the ragged stranger, waving his hands against something upon his left and up the slope a little behind him. "Not there, young master," he implored again, and shuddered as he spoke. And no despair came near Ramon Alonso then to tempt all his aspirations down to their dooms, for he saw by the stranger's unmistakable terror he had only to keep on upward and a little more to his right to come very soon in sight of the house in the wood. "I have business with the magician," replied Ramon Alonso. "May all such blessed saints defend us as can," said the stranger. He wrapped his cloak round him with a trembling hand, and went shuddering down the slope, drivelling terrified prayer. "A fair night to you, signor," called out Ramon Alonso. "Clearly not far," he added, thinking aloud. And once more he heard struggling feebly against the eerie voice of the wind those plaintive words imploring, "Not there, young master, not there." And pressing on in the direction against which those feeble hands had waved so earnestly, he had gone some while against wind and slope and branches, when a feeling came dankly upon him, as though exuded from the deep moss all around him, that he came no nearer to the house in the wood. He halted then, and called out loud in the darkness, "If there be a magician in this wood, let him appear." He waited, and the wind sang on triumphantly, singing of spaces unconcerned with man, blue fields of the wind's roving, dark gardens amongst the stars. He waited there, and no magician came. So he sat on a boulder that was all deep with moss, and leaned back on it and looked into the wood, and saw nothing there but blackness and outlines of oak boles. There he pondered how to come to his journey's end, and then it came to him that this was no common journey, to be guided by the rules of ordinary wayfaring, but having a magician as its destination, and in an ominous wood, it were better guided by spell or magic or omen. And he meditated upon how he should come by a spell, and as he thought of spells, he remembered the scroll he bore, with the ink of the magician upon it, written 80 years agone. Now, Ramon Alonso's studies had not extended so far as the art of writing. The good fathers in their school on the high hill near his home had taught him orally all that is needful to know, and much more he had learned for himself, but not by reading. Script, therefore, in black ink upon a scroll was in itself wonderful to him, and, knowing it to have been penned by a magician, he reasonably regarded it as a spell. Arising then from his seat, he waved the scroll high in the night, and knowing the liking that secret folk oft show for the number 3, he waved it thrice. And there before him was the house in the wood. It seemed to have slid down quietly from the high places of night, or it quietly appeared out of darkness that had hidden it hitherto. But the silence that cloaked its appearance almost instantly glided away, giving place to Arabian music that haunted the air overhead, and plaintive Hindu love chants that yearned in the dark. Then windows flashed into light, and there, just in front of the mossy stone that the young man had made his seat, was an old green door, all studded with old green knobs. The door was ajar. Ramon Alonso stepped forward and pushed the green door open, and the magician came to his door with that alacrity with which the spider descends to the spot in its web that is shaken by some lost-winged traveler's arrival. He was in the great black silk cloak that the young man's grandfather knew, but he wore great spectacles now, for he was older than he'd been 80 years ago, in spite of his magic art. Ramon Alonso bowed, and the master smiled, though whether he smiled for welcome, or at a doom that hung over the strangers who troubled his door, there was no way for unlearned men to know. Then quickly, though still without fear, Ramon Alonso thrust out the scroll that he bore, with the magician's own writing upon it, all in black ink, saying, word for word as his father had bade him say, "I am the grandson of him that taught you the taking of boars nigh 80 years ago." The magician received it, and as he read, his smile changed its nature, and appeared to Ramon Alonso somewhat more wholesome, having something in common with smiles of unlearned men, that they smile at what is pleasant in earthly affairs. With a tact that well became him, the master of magic made no inquiry after the young man's grandfather, for as the rich do not speak of poverty to the poor, or the learned discourse on ignorance to the unlearned, this sage that had mastered the way of surviving the years spoke seldom with common men on the matter of death. But he bowed a welcome as though Ramon Alonso were not entirely a stranger, and the young man expressed the pleasure that he felt at meeting a master of arts. "There is but one art," answered the master. "It is the one I would study," replied Ramon Alonso. "Ah," said the magician. And with an air now grown grave, as though somewhat pondering, he raised his arm and summoned up a draught, which closed his green door. When the door was shut, and the draught had run home, brushing by the loose silk sleeve of the magician to its haunt in the dark of the house, which Ramon Alonso perceived to be full of crannies, the host led his guest to an adjacent room, whence the savor of meats arose as he opened the door, and there was a repast already cooked and spread, waiting for Ramon Alonso. But what arts those meats were kept smoking upon that table, ready for any stranger that should come in from the wood, ready perhaps since the days of the young man's grandfather, I tell not to the sage, for it is far too well acquainted already with the preservation of meat. With a bow and a wave of his arm, the magician appointed a chair to Ramon Alonso, and not till his guest was seated before the meats did the magician speak again. "So you would study the art," he said. "Master," the young man answered him, "I would." "Know, then," the magician said, "that all those exercises that men call arts, and all wisdom and all knowledge are but humble branches of that worthy study that is justly named the art. Nor is this to be revealed to all chance-come travelers that may imperil themselves by entering my house in the wood. My gratitude to your grandfather, however, for some while now unpaid, I trust he prospers, renders me anxious to serve you, for he taught me a branch of learning that he had studied well. It was, moreover, one of those studies that my researches had not yet covered, the matter of the hunting of boars. And from this, as from every science that learning knows, the art hath increase, and becometh a yet more awful and reverend power, whereby to astound the vulgar, and to punish error, not only in this wood, but finally to drive it out of all worldly affairs. And he spoke swiftly past his mention of Ramon Alonzo's grandfather, lest his guest should have the embarrassment of admitting that his grandfather had shared with all the unlearned the vulgar inability to withstand the flight of the years. For himself, he kept on a shelf in an upper room a bottle of that medicine philosophers use, which is named Elixir Vitae, wherein were sufficient doses to ensure his survival till the time when he knew that the world would begin to grow bad. He took one dose in every generation. By certain turns in the tide of life, in those that he watched, a touch of gray over the ears, a broadening or a calming, he knew that the heyday of a generation was past, and the time had come for his dose. And then he would go one night by resounding stairs that were never troubled by anything human but him, whatever the rats might dare. And so he would come with his ponderous golden key, for an iron one would have long since rusted away, to the lock he turned only once every 30 years. And opening the heavy door at the top of the stairs and entering that upper room, he would find his bottle gray with dust on its shelf, perhaps entirely hidden by little curtains that the spiders had drawn across it, and measuring his dose by moonlight, he would drink it full in the rays as though he shared the secret alone with the moon. Then back he would go down those age-worn steps of oak, with his old mind suddenly lightened of the cares of that generation, free from its foibles, untroubled by its problems, neither cramped nor duped by its fashions, unyoked by its causes, undriven by its aims, fresh and keen for the wisdom and folly of a new generation. Such a mind, well stored with the wisdom of several ages and repeatedly refreshed with the nimble alertness of youth, now crossed in brief conversation the young mind of Ramon Alonzo, like a terrible blade of Toledo, sharpened in ancient battles, meeting a well-wrought rapier coming fresh to its first war. My grandfather, unfortunately, came to his death, said Ramon Alonzo. Alas, said the master. Our family's well used to it, said the youth with a certain pride, for poverty has its pride as well as wealth, and Ramon Alonzo would not be abashed by his forebear's lack of years, even though he should speak with an immortal. Is that so? Said the master. I thank you, said Ramon Alonzo, for the noble sentiments you so graciously felt for my grandfather, and shall greatly value such learning as you may have leisure to teach me, for I would make gold out of the baser metals, my family having great need of it. There are secrets you shall not learn, replied the magician, for I may impart them to none. But the making of gold is amongst the least of the crafts that are used by those skilled in the art, and were only a poor return for the learning I had from your grandfather concerning the hunting of boars. Beyond this wood, said Ramon Alonzo, we set much store by gold, and value it beyond the hunting of boars. Beyond this wood, replied the master, lies error, to extirpate which is the object of my studies. For this my lamp is lit, to the grief of the owls, and often burns till lark song. Of the things you shall learn here, earliest the prime is this, that the pursuit of the philosophers is welfare. To this gold often contributes, often it thwarts it. But it was plainly taught by your grandfather that the hunting of boars is amongst those things that bring pure joy to man. This study must therefore always be preferred to such as only bring us happiness incompletely, or that have been known to fail to bring it at all, as the hunting of boars never failed, so I learned from your grandfather. I fear that my grandfather, said the young man deprecatingly, was but ill-equipped for discourse with a philosopher, having had insufficient leisure, as I have often been told, for learning. Your grandfather, answered the master, was a very great philosopher. Not only had he found the way to happiness, but of that way was a most constant explorer, till none may doubt that he knew its every turning. For he could track the boars to the forest all the way from the fields where they rooted, knowing what fields they would seek, and the hour at which they would leave them. and could hearten his hounds while they hunted, even through watery places, and when scent was lost and all their cunning was gone, he still could lead them on. And so he brought them upon many a boar, and slew his quarry with spear thrusts that he had practised, and took its tusky head, which was his happiness, and rarely failed to achieve it, having so deeply studied the way. I also followed the pursuit of happiness, studying all those methods that are most in use amongst men, as well as some that are hidden from them, and most of these methods are vain, leaving few that are worthy of the investigation of one holding the rank that I now hold amongst wizards. Of those few that have stood the test of my most laborious analysis, is this one that I owe to the researches of your grandfather, and which, seeing how few are the ways of attaining happiness, is certainly amongst the 4 great branches of learning. Who knows these 4 great studies hath 4 different ways of approach to the goal of mankind, and hath that might that is to be got by complete wisdom alone. For this cause I give great honor to your grandfather, and extol his name, and bless it by means of spells, and in my estimation place it high amongst the names of those whose learning is light in the world. Alas that his studies gave him no time for that last erudition, which could have ensured his survival to these days and beyond them. The young man was surprised at the value the master placed upon boar hunting, for, having as yet learned nothing about philosophy, he vaguely and foolishly believed it to be concerned with mere intricate words, and did not know in his youthful ignorance that its real concern was with happiness. Such folly is scarce becoming to young heroes, yet having sought to lure my reader's interest towards him, I feel it my duty to tell the least of his weaknesses, without which my portrait of him would be a false one. And so I expose his ignorance to the eyes of a later age. He will not be abashed by it now. But seated beside the meat at that magic table, he felt the triviality of his schoolboy's scraps of learning before every particle that the magician chose to reveal from his lore. And with all the intensity that trifles can summon up in youth, he regretted his disparagement of his grandfather, not on account of his own reverence for him, but because he now perceived him to have been one that the master held in honor. To cover his confusion, he poured himself out some wine from a beaker in his right hand, partly bronze, partly glass, the bronze and glass being intermingled by magic, and having filled his cup, a clear hollowed crystal, he hastily drank it before he spoke again. And the wine was a magic wine, with a taste of flowers, yet of flowers unknown to earth, and a flavor of spices, yet of spices ungathered in any isle Spain knew, and it had in it a memory and a music, and came to the blood like one that was closely kin, and yet of a kinship from ages and ages ago. And all of a sudden the young man saw his folly, in deeming that philosophy prefers the way to the end, and so for a moment he saw his grandfather's wisdom. But that wonderful wine's inspiration died swiftly away, and his thoughts were concerned again with the making of gold. The magician had silently watched him drink of that magic vintage. "It comes not from these vineyards," he said, and he waved his arm so wide that he seemed to indicate no vineyard of Spain, nor the neighboring kingdom of Portugal, nor France, nor Africa, nor the German lands, Italy, Greece, nor the islands. "Whence?" asked Ramon Alonso, leaning forward in earnest wonder. And the magician extended his arm, pointing it higher. It seemed to point towards the evening star, that low and blue and large was blinking beyond the window. "It is magic," said Ramon Alonso. "All's magic here," said the master. Thank you so much for joining my stream today. I'm going to go ahead and close out there. I know it's a little bit shorter today, but my throat has been still recovering from a little bit of sickness that I've had. But thank you, and see you again soon.